All right. MOvember, day 28. I've been threatening to talk about the polyvagal theory, and to be honest, it overwhelms me. It's funny, you know. When I first came in contact with Stephen Porges, I had the reaction. I think that the author of the foreword of the book, Bessel van der Kolk, had when he first came across the information. Of course, that was before me. But I remember my experience was being at a conference down in Melbourne for the Australian Childhood Foundation, and Dan Siegel, Bessel van der Kolk, Alan Shaw, Ed Tronick were all present. Pat Ogden as well, and Dan Hughes. And they just blew my mind over a period of 5 days. I was aware of Dan Siegel. I was reading everything I could get on this sort of new thought of interpersonal neurobiology, this new school. Books that inspired me at the time were Pat Ogden, Sensory Motor Psychotherapy, the Unspoken Voice by Levine, the stuff that Siegel was doing on the Mindful Therapist, and it was just exciting. And Alan Shaw and Alex Katahakis, who's just written this book, Alexandra Katahakis, she's the Centre for Healthy Sexes clinical director, senior fellow at the Meadows. I heard her do a lecture honouring Alan Shaw, but talking about Patrick Carnes' work. And she said that the first time she'd heard Alan Shaw speak, she left the building and didn't really know what he'd said, but it just blew him. You know, she was on fire, actually. She was on fire. And I remember that. I remember being on fire, just walking out of there thinking, this is changing everything. It didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater for me, because I could see where Pia, John Bradshaw, Pia Melody, all those, those clinicians back then were flying by the seat of their pants without the sort of assistance of science, really. So experientially, they were arriving at a lot of the same places. Pia in 1989 wrote in Breaking Free that you find trauma in the body sensations and feeling states, which has been confirmed by the neuroscience. It's just that those sensations now, Porges came along and just changed everything, gave us a third option when it came to how people reacted. But Bessel van der Kolk wrote that he said, on the morning of May 21, 1999, we had the most memorable series of lectures of the 22 years he had run the Boston Annual Trauma Conference. He introduced the notion of neuroplasticity. Let me read that again. The day opened with Bruce McEwen talking about stress in the hippocampus, and introduced the notion of neuroplasticity, and showed that Raymond Cahal's dire dictum of anatomy is destiny, that the neural connections in the brain are immutably fixed, was incorrect. He goes on to say that the final speaker that morning was Stephen Porges, who talked about the polyvagal theory of emotions. That lecture caused a fundamental shift to how he, Bessel, and many of his colleagues understand the work we do today. Clinicians and researchers who deal with people with histories of chronic trauma are routinely confronted with fight, flight, and freeze reactions. I remember reading this to a boss of mine, because I am one of these guys. You know, when I go to conferences, I'm sort of thinking about me first, always trying to find the next bit to heal me. But I remember reading this to a boss, because I'm difficult to work with. I'm passionate, I'm crazy, I'm obsessive, I'm the flight type trauma, so it can be difficult when you're working with people with trauma. And I remember taking this into the boss, and he writes, our patients, and occasionally our colleagues, easily take offence, and they often disorganise their and our lives by becoming too angry, too ashamed, and too frozen. Minor irritations easily turn into catastrophes. Small failures of communication are difficult to gloss over and easily turn into dramatic interpersonal conflicts. And this line I like in particular. The milk of human kindness, such an essential nutrient in making life bearable, all too often fails to have a significant impact on the despair, rage, and terror of the people with histories of trauma and abandonment. This was something that I remember, reading and just thinking, that's me, that's how I lived. And I've seen a lot of the people I work with live that way. And Peter's model of the body, thought, feelings and behavior, and there's an event, we take it in as data. And look, that was really helpful for a lot of experiences. But then there was this experience, when the data got so overwhelming, and now we know what it triggered was this sort of polyvagal response, this fight, flight, freeze reaction that overrides, and so the zone overrides our ability to sort of what Porges says, vaguely break with our mammalian sort of system, be able to sort of handbrake it and really perceive, is this threat, is this play or danger? And when you grow up with developmental trauma, it affects that functionality of the brain. It's a strange thing, because you see a lot of people, they come into treatment and they say, just got to pull my socks up and work harder and work the steps harder. And this is something that's organic. It's organically damaged in us. I really get frustrated sometimes when I see people in recovery that demand that people sort of do things their way. And if you haven't got PTSD and you're in recovery and you're telling someone with PTSD how they should work harder, that's pretty spiritually offensive. To thine own self be true. So the literature that when I was thinking about just wanting to introduce and talk about this idea just for MOvember, was that men and women will take their life when this part of their brain is damaged, and we do it because we go into what Alan Shaw says is this implicit memory, where we just get overwhelmed with dread, which is the original trauma. And at that point, that this milk of human kindness, nothing will touch it. And even taking your own life just seems like the only way out. So I suppose when it comes into how this works with treatment, there's a few little things I'll read out, just little snapshots. The Polyvagal Theory also helps us understand the capacity of the tone of the voice and rhythms of speech, as well as the faces of our loved ones, to restore that physiological equilibrium. They talk about therapy. For years we've known that it's not so much the model, but it's the relationship, the therapeutic alliance. And Siegel writes about that in The Mindful Therapist, and how being present and really attuning, and the sort of neurobiology of the we, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems responding, the mirror neurons responding, or he says the sponge neurons, And in a relationship, I thought, why does therapy work? Why do I, even though I can be crass, eccentric, swear too much, can't spell to save my life, yet I can build trust with clients. I've done it now for nearly 30 years. And I really get it, is what Porges says, that in the moment, if I can regulate and be present, if I can be soft in my tone so their middle ear doesn't pick up a sense of threat or fear or stress, that if my orbital muscles are relaxed and my gaze is soft and my body language is not presenting as threatening. I've never really believed in therapy that's dominating or tells someone else their reality. I really do think that good therapy is where you help the client work out what the question is. And generally, once you do that, the answer will sort of emerge. Yes, sometimes when there's crisis situations, we need to seek advice, and as Patrick Kahn says, have some provisional beliefs where we sort of get inspired and need to take on the beliefs of others for a while just to get us out of hell. But the hope, I think, for people that the polyvagal system explains is that if you really feel that every so often you just lose the ability to be in the moment and you go to a fight, flight, freeze response, and have really struggled with that, this information helps us understand it. Things like people with impaired social engagement systems are prone to misinterpret safety as threat and objective danger as safety. The visceral feedback system fails to protect them or prevents them from engaging in the fullness of what life has to offer. People who are chronically traumatized have a tendency to become overwhelmed and triggered by their seemingly unmanageable visceral feedback systems that cannot be modified by a functional social engagement system. So in other words, that as Dan Siegel so aptly says in the hand model of the brain, the spine, the top of the brain stem, the limbic system, and our frontal cortex sort of sits in our head, that at this point, all that executive thinking in our upper cortex, we lose it, we flip our lid, as he says, and we're functioning from here. And if our fight, flight, freeze can't save us, for some of us that have that, the fight, flight, and the limbic system, then that vagal nerve goes from the brain to the back of the heart, lowers the heart rate, and we just pass out. And I've had people come into treatment and they got no idea why that happens to them. They're frustrated and angry because they just faint. They just collapse under that regress state. And just to find out that it's not something that you're not doing wrong. It's not something that you're not working hard enough. It's the fact that there's a complex post-traumatic stress. And whether in the next DSM-5 or 6, DSM-6 they call it developmental trauma disorder, as Bessel has sort of put forward, or not, I think the argument is still going to be pushing forward with all this sort of science now offering us an explanation that those folks that do lose that ability to vaguely, as Paul just says, put that handbrake on and really be able to see, is this danger or play, and all that misreading was finally have a diagnosis that fits the crime, not just throwing around symptoms and coming up with one personality disorder after the other. Porges helped us understand how dynamic our biological systems are and gave us an explanation why a kind face and a soothing tone of voice can dramatically alter the entire organization of the human organism. That is, how being seen and understood can help shift people out of disorganized and fearful states. And I think that's been the skill of a lot of therapists that come along, and when they've got that ability to just be present, as Siegel says, be really mindful and tune in, and then offer that attunement, that opportunity for the mirror neurons to sort of help attune the client, then we get good results and have done for a long time. This is giving clinicians that sort of information to help us sort of get there faster. And the last thing that Bessel writes in regards to Porges is, the polyvagal theory implies that more attention needs to be paid to the development of interventions that either promote activation of the social vagus or dampen the sympathetic tone. One major implication is the need to pay closer attention to the therapeutic use of play, rough and tumble behaviours that serve as preliminary exercises to develop adaptive, defensive and aggressive behaviours as a means of shifting people out of fight and flight reactions into loving and mutually engaged mobilisation. So if you're out there and you're really struggling with that powerlessness of that fight, flight, freeze part of the brain, then please, there's plenty of literature out there. The Interpersonal Neurobiology School of Thought has so many things. This great handbook, the Pocket Guide, it teaches. Siegel takes us through all the phrases and different things we need to learn. I've really enjoyed this book for the practicality of working with clients with trauma. And so if you're a clinician out there or someone that's just working with trauma and you want that sort of snapshot of how can I be more useful and helpful and informed, these books help tell the story. Siegel and Alan Shaw and Tronick and Ogden and Levine, we're just so lucky at this time in our lives. And there's so much more I'd like to say about it, but the idea of these MOvember downloads is to just pique up people's interest. If anything I've said is useful tonight, this is the book to get. Look up Stephen Porges online. I'll dump some links on the end of this video. There's some fantastic resources out there for you. Take care.